Shabbat Shalom. 36 years strikes me as well past the statute of limitations on spoiler alerts. But if it isn't, then this might be a good time to get up and leave the room. Because while it would definitely be in bad taste for me to tell you how the new Star Wars movie ends, I have to believe that at this point it's safe to publicly speak about the original trilogy. Specifically, the pivotal scene in The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke Skywalker discovers the truth about his father. Having seen the new movie right when it came out, over vacation, I resolved to do what any self-respecting parent would do: download all the original Star Wars movies so I could experience them with my children. And as I watched them, and I watched my children watch them, and I saw their reaction when Darth Vader informed Luke that he was, in fact, his father, it became clear to me in a way that I never realized way back when what this movie was really about. The central drama of this epic space drama opera is not just good guys versus bad guys, or Han and Leia, or even a mysterious force that pervades the universe. At the core of Star Wars is the most classic mythological trope of all: the tale of father and son. Hidden as a child in order to shield his life from his father, our protagonist Luke grows up unaware of his identity. Luke's redemption, we come to learn, will only arrive by way of him discovering that identity. Our hero has a greater purpose, a calling to liberate his people. His path, however, is not straightforward. There is a complication. In order for him to realize his personal and national destiny, he will have to confront the very person who not only gave him life, but is also the oppressor of his newfound kin, and perversely seeks his destruction. In the dying words of Yoda, "You must confront Vader, then, only then, a Jedi you will be." From the very beginning of the trilogy until its final scene, this tale is one of how a son discovers, confronts, and eventually transcends the truth of his pater familias, redeems his people, and most importantly, resolves the conflicts embedded in his identity. The final book Sigmund Freud wrote, as his health was in decline and he and his family escaped the Nazis to London, was called Moses and Monotheism. It is unquestionably a strange and difficult book to read. In a very peculiar fashion, Freud seeks to recapitulate, expand, and explain the biography of Moses in a manner that, according to the late great scholar of Freud and beloved congregant of Park Avenue Synagogue, Dr. Emanuel Rice, reflects Freud's own journey home to the Jewish identity from which he had long since been estranged. In all the book's complexities, there is one observation that Freud makes, both simple and significant, that for me sheds new light onto the tale of Moses and his confrontation with Pharaoh, and that is the insight that Moses was an Egyptian. His name was an Egyptian name. He grew up not as a Hebrew, but in the comforts of Egyptian society. In the eyes of the daughters of Midian, the text explains, Moses was perceived to be an Egyptian. Freud wrote that for 3 weeks in Rome, he visited Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses, studying it, measuring it, and sketching it. One need not be trained as a psychoanalyst to speculate as to why the assimilated Freud was so drawn to the Egyptian dimension of Moses, always, but especially at the end of his life. And while not every aspect of Freud's book ring true to the biblical text, it's through the prism of Freud's insight on Moses' Egyptianness, and to be sure, the 1980 cinematic classic, that gave me new insight and aha moment into the drama about which we read this morning. Moses, after all, wasn't just any Egyptian. He was, depending on how you look at it, a son, grandson, or adopted child into the house of Pharaoh itself. Freud reasons that Moses' life follows classic mythological structures. A child filled with great promise is born into a dangerous circumstance. Saved from death, he will discover his parentage, wreak vengeance on his father, and, recognized by his people, attain fame and greatness. The parallels, though not exact, are close enough to bring into relief a critical aspect of Moses' story that, though sit in plain sight under our very nose, is often missed or dismissed. The story of Exodus is not just the story of the liberation of a people or the fulfillment of a long-standing divine promise. This story is a story of one man, Moses, who, in order to fulfill his personal and national destiny, in order to resolve the complexities of his personal identity, had to confront the dominant father figure of his life, Pharaoh. And if you read the tale as such, as a story of father and son, then so many other things come into focus. We all know that Moses resists when called on by God. No doubt his speech impediment played a part in his demurral. But the more simple reason, which is actually the first and final reason Moses provides, is Pharaoh. Me Anochi, he says. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? God could have chosen a slave as a liberator of the Hebrews, an Israelite with no connection to the house of Pharaoh. But the poetry and pathos of our tale is that God didn't. God picked the one person who, long before our present-day hyphenated identities, had the most hyphenated identity of all, as an Egyptian and as a Hebrew. Moses is rejected by the Israelites for being Egyptian. He's rejected by the Egyptians for being a Hebrew. He's alive only by way of having survived the very edict of his father figure, in whose household, ironically, he would be raised. Moses doesn't have an answer to the most basic question of all. Me Anochi, who am I? And it's a journey to that answer as much as the one to the promised land, which stitches his biography together. So many psychic conflicts, so many unresolved ambivalencies. And the only way for Moses to resolve it all is through the cathartic and altogether Oedipal, minus the stuff about the mother, of participating in his father's downfall. I can only hope that Moses' medical insurance covered the therapy bills he would incur over his lifetime. And as far-fetched as this reading of the text may sound, a passing knowledge of the Bible explained shows us that this pattern, with some modification, is underlying not just the biography of Moses, but is a discernible trope throughout the Bible. Think about it. In order for Abraham to become Abraham, he had to smash the idols of his father, leaving his father's home to the land that God would show him. Isaac, we know, would emerge from his near-death experience at the hands of Abraham with a forever ruptured relationship, father and son to never speak again. Jacob needed to flee the house of his father and mother in order to develop into his own person, in order to become Israel. So too Joseph would only achieve his eventual and intended purpose by being cast out of his father's home to Egypt. Rebekah, Rachel, Leah, Ruth, all of them rebel, leave, or are sent away from their households of origin. Even Adam and Eve, one could argue, would only achieve their humanity by way of leaving the garden of their divine parent. None of these heroes and heroines are who they are because they stayed put and towed the line of the prior generation. As Freud would write, a hero is someone who has the courage to rebel against his father and has, in the end, victoriously overcome him. The Moses-Pharaoh story is more complicated than most, but it's entirely consistent with a broader biblical pattern. Like those who preceded him, like those who would follow, Moses fulfills his destiny and arrives at the fullness of his humanity by way of differentiating himself from the very household that gave him life in the first place. One of my greatest joys, second only to the love of my wife and children, is a bond I share with my parents. And yet when I think about the choices I have made and the person I have become, I can say that with absolute surety, as important as the influence of my parents has been and continues to be, it's been those moments when my choices differed from or ran counter to their counsel that made me who I am. In the successes I've enjoyed and the mistakes I have and continue to make, it's only by way of differentiating myself from my household of origin that my identity, or for that matter, anyone's identity, can actually take shape. There is, according to our tradition, no mitzvah more important than honoring one's parents, but it's a mitzvah that exists alongside our shared search for autonomy and our need and our right to individuate so we can become our own person and live lives of our own choosing. Such moments of individuation, dramatic and traumatic as they may be, are natural, healthy, and ultimately important opportunities for personal growth. We reflect back on them, knowing that it was those moments, not the moments we acquiesced, that have made us who we are. And it's not a bad thing, explains Freud. It's a cycle that can yield a soft landing. The rebellions of adolescence, in which a person seeks to be everything a parent is not, are often followed by an adulthood in which a person manifests the very characteristics of the parent which had been previously condemned and rejected. It's not just Moses, or for that matter Luke, who needed to confront their households of origin in order to arrive at their true selves. It is each and every one of us who need to understand and embrace our identities as both extensions of and reactions against that which came before. Le dor vador does not mean that one generation parrots the behaviors of the prior one. Le dor vador means that each generation learns from the prior one and is extended the opportunity to establish its identity on its own terms. All of which if taken to its logical conclusion, is both thrilling and very, very sobering. Because if this is the case, if this is how I understand the formation of my own identity and identity formation writ large, then I must, I suppose, by extension, strap on the proverbial seatbelt for what is in store for my relationship with my children. It's a realization both frightening and not a little bit depressing to think that if I want my children, the objects of my affection, dedication, and influence, to fulfill my highest wish, namely to become the fullest and most authentic expressions of their truest selves, to be able to answer the question of me, Anochi, who am I, in full confidence, then I must be willing to concede that their journeys may in fact only be achieved by way of them reacting, confronting, and perhaps rejecting the very life that I spent so much time seeking to impress upon them. And while I hope one day they will return to the proverbial nest, there are no guarantees, not for me and not for everyone. And so I savored every moment watching those old movies with my children, scratching their backs, hoping then, as always, that through some mystical process of osmosis, they would come to share my enthusiasm for the things I love so. Every parent understands the impossible wish to freeze time. I was then, and remain today, well aware that one day, in the not too distant future, the distance between me and my child may grow to be far greater than what the length of one father's outstretched arm can traverse. One day they too will need to differentiate themselves to establish their space and autonomy. And I can tell you right now, I won't like it, not one bit. And the knowledge that I'm not the first to experience this process won't make it any easier. What I will do, I suppose, what I have to do, what everyone has to do, is to let my grip loosen, bite down hard, and pray that our bond will prove sufficiently supple, elastic, and suffused with love, so as it will spring back to form in due time. It is, after all, their right, and my highest hope, that they should walk this earth with a full-throated answer to the question of me, Anochi, who am I? And should the answer to that question come at my expense, then so be it. it will be well worth the journey. Shabbat Shalom.